All right, folks, it's back in action here. What we're going to do on this page of notes is we are actually going to unwrap the unit circle, and as strange as that sounds, it's essentially what it's going to actually look like. We're going to take all of our values from our unit circle, and we're actually going to plot those as ordered pairs along a graph and see where those graphs of sine and cosine actually come from. The same graphs that we looked at in the previous video when we were just looking at general characteristics. So we're going to get an understanding of where those points come from. So what I want you to do is I want you to notice on these tables here, I have all of our key values from our unit circle listed here. So you can see that we've got the quadrant angles at 0 and at pi over 2 and pi and 3 pi over 2, and we come back around to 2 pi. Down here I have a similar table for cosine. So again, we have our 0, we have our pi over 2, our pi, our 3 pi over 2, and our 2 pi. And then we've got each of our other key values. So we've got all of our 30-degree reference angles of pi over 6, we've got 5 pi over 6, 7 pi over 6, and 11 pi over 6. Again, we have them down here for our cosine, pi over 6, 5 pi over 6, 7 pi over 6, and our 11 pi over 6. We also have our key values for our 45-degree reference angle, our pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, 7 pi over 4, and we have them down here with our cosine as well. And then lastly, we have our 60-degree reference angles, and we have all of those here as well. So it's important to see how these all break down. And what I want you to do is I want you to pause the video, and I want you to complete these tables, and then we'll look at how we can actually use these values to create our graphs for sine and cosine. So go ahead, pause the video, complete the tables. Shouldn't take you long, especially if you've been working on those practice quizzes and mastery quizzes for the unit circle. Okay, so you may want to check your values. Go ahead and you might need to pause again. Just check those values, make sure that you've got those all correct. And now let's take a look and see what we can do with these actual values. All right, what I also want to remind you about is that, of course, we have our quadrant angle right here and here. Okay, so there's our quadrant angle. And then our first quadrant would land right here. And as you can see, all of our values are positive. Okay, so sine was positive there. Then we've got another quadrant angle. And then moving on, we're into our second quadrant. And of course, our sine values are still positive. Our next quadrant angle. And then now we've moved into the third quadrant. And the only values that should be positive would be our tangent. So that makes sense that all those are negative. And I've got another quadrant angle, and then I move into my last quadrant, and we would have our cosine would be positive, which makes sense that our sine values are negative there. So we've got our first, second, third, and fourth quadrants. So we could come down here for our cosine table, and we could do a similar marking. And again, we could, this time I'm going to label them with our quadrant numbers so that you've got it actually in both forms. So there's our first quadrant, we have our second quadrant, finding that angle, then we've got our third quadrant, and oops, didn't mean to write that way, I meant to write, sorry, a 3, not a 4, oops, and our last one, and then our fourth quadrant. There we go. And we can see that that follows our all students take calculus as well. All right, so how can we actually use these values to create a nice graph for us? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to consider our x-axis. We're going to actually consider that our theta, okay? So that's where we're going to plot our angle measures. And what stands out to me when I look at this, and I want it to stand out to you, is that at the quadrants, we get, that didn't highlight very well, at our quadrants, we get all of our cleanest numbers, our 0, our 1s, and our -1s. So we can go ahead and we can plot those. So I can see and remember from the previous video that we only are ever going to go as low as a -1, and we're only going to go as high as a +1. And since I have 4 quadrants, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to divide this into 4 little pieces. That's going to make it a little bit easier for me to break this down. And what I'll do is I'll say that I'll start here at 0, and then my next nice value here would be at pi over 2. And then I'll call this one pi, I'll call this 3 pi over 2, and I'll call this 2 pi. Of course, if I want to go backwards, I could actually go backwards and I could call this a negative pi over 2. And remember, that would be the same as a positive 3 pi over 2. So now I can start plotting these. At a theta value of 0, I get sine of 0, so I've got that point. At pi over 2, reading from my chart up above, I go up to 1. At pi, I go back to 0. At 3 pi over 2, I drop down to a negative 1. And at 2 pi, I get back to 0. So what I can do is I can actually start to connect this. Now, I'm connecting this because I already know what this is supposed to look like, but we'll use our chart to help us understand that this graph actually makes sense. Remember, I can put arrows there. This can come back down here if we wanted to extend this a little bit more. And what we want to be able to look at here is that, let's say at pi over 4. So at pi over 4, I would be halfway between 0 and pi over 2. And at pi over 4, when I look at my graph, that actually looks like it's about right there at a radical 2 over 2. I could even, I could type that in my calculator and that would actually approximate out pretty well there. So we can see that this, if we plotted all these other points, it would actually create this nice curve for us. So what that's going to do is that's going to give us some new values and some new vocabulary. The amplitude is what we're going to now describe as the amount that we go above or below what I will often refer to as this center line, okay? We can see that this graph is divided evenly above and below that x-axis. So the amplitude is how much did the graph go above and below that line right there. So our amplitude here is a 1. Our period, I talked about this in the previous video, it's how long it takes to repeat this entire process from here to here. And our period is 2 pi, that's an entire unit circle. Our domain, as we discussed already, is negative infinity to positive infinity, because it's just going to keep going. And our range is our negative 1 to a positive 1, inclusive on each end. So that is how we actually can unwrap all the values from our unit circle and actually create a sine graph. We can do the same thing for our cosine graph. We can come down here and we're going to plot these in pretty much the exact same way. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to divide this up in the same way that I did before into nice 4 pieces. If I want, I can go back as well. These are going to be the same quadrant angles. So this is still going to be a pi over 2. This is still going to be our pi, our 3 pi over 2, and our 2 pi. This is still going to be a negative pi over 2. Okay. We're still going to go as low as a negative 1 and as high as a positive 1. We already saw that from our chart. And then now if we want to plot these, instead of starting at 0, 0, we can read from our chart that at a theta value of 0, the cosine actually starts at a positive 1. And then at pi over 2, now I'm back at the 0. Then I go down. Then I'm going to come back to 0, and then I'm going to come back up, just reading these points from my chart up above. Now, when I draw in my cosine graph, I find these a little bit more challenging to draw. This first piece is almost like a quarter of a circle, and then it's going to come down, and this part is going to create almost like a semicircle. I often just kind of sketch those in a little bit. This isn't my best one on my iPad here. So that would get my cosine graph. I can put arrows there. And then if we wanted, we could continue this back if you wanted to be able to see what this looks like on the other side there. So that gets us our whole shape. Similar to our sine graph, what we can see is that it's equally spaced above and below our x-axis, which means our amplitude is how much does it go above and below that center line there. And our amplitude in this case is 1. It still is a period of 2 pi. We can see that because I start here, and once I travel this entire path, the whole cycle starts all over again. Our domain is negative infinity to positive infinity, and our range is a -1 to 1 inclusive. So really the purpose of this video is just to help you understand how the values from around the unit circle actually create these sine and cosine graphs. And then in the rest of this chapter, what we're going to do is we're going to actually start learning how to graph these without having to do a whole entire chart every time.